Most Americans experience at least one chronic disease. The vast majority, 70+% of Americans are overweight or obese. 20 million Americans experience an episode of major depression in the course of just 1 year. And we eat terrible food. Is there a connection? Of course there is. And you've likely heard about this standard American diet or Western pattern diet and how it's been associated with all of these health problems I just described. But what you probably don't know is the manipulation that's going on beneath the surface. So in this video, we're going to cover some of the lesser known and lesser understood concepts that are actually explaining a lot of what's going on right now. I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter. Okay, let's start with a basic question. Do Americans actually know that what they're eating is unhealthy? So there was a poll done in 2016 by the Pew Research Institute that looked at this and a number of other very interesting questions. In this poll, they found that most Americans believe our eating habits are less healthy than they were 20 years ago. When it came to the impact of food on our health, 72% said that healthy eating is key to a long and a healthy life, more so actually than genetics or physical activity. 66% of Americans report hearing about the positive effects of our food on at least a couple of times a week type basis. So it seems clear we know what we need to be doing and why to do it. So are we doing it? In the same survey from Pew, they asked people whether they felt they were eating healthfully. Most people said they felt they should be eating healthier, and while 73% of respondents said that when it came to food, their main focus was on getting good nutrition, in a later question, 57% said they actually eat usually whatever is easy and whatever is most convenient. Here's the way the food industry is set up. You have a handful of corporations producing the majority of our food products, and most of these products are explicitly created in such a way that they are bad for our health. So I often cite this study from a few years back that looked at the amount of added sweetener in our foods. And you probably understand at this point, there's really no need to have added sweetener in anything, food or drink. It's not good for us. It causes a bunch of problems. There are a number of studies specifically looking at sugar-sweetened beverages and their negative impacts on health. So in this study, though, they showed that almost 70% of the foods that they looked at, over 1 million foods in the U.S. Supermarket industry, actually contained added sweetener. So this is just the default. This is the way that our typical food is created. It's anti-correlated with health, which, let me say that again, our food, the typical food, is anti-correlated with health because it contains ingredients that are explicitly unhealthy. By saturating the market with unhealthy food, marketing this food to us when we're too young to understand these subconscious ploys for our attention and for our brand preferences, by incentivizing poor food choices, toying with our reward system to keep us hooked, and a number of other tactics, food manufacturers have essentially established a system in which it's really, really hard to make good choices, even when we want to. This leads me to another thing that is a major concern. Especially in America, we are very concerned with the ideas of freedom and autonomy, and I'm all for these concepts, but as it relates to our choices around food, these terms have been co-opted. We have been led to believe that it is completely up to us whether we want to eat junk food or healthy food, and that if we, like most Americans, decide to eat something like fast food, the health consequences are on us because we had autonomy over that decision. So it's really hiding behind this argument of freedom of choice that manufacturers are able to pitch their unhealthy products and basically be removed from any sort of blame when we suffer the negative health consequences. They don't take, any sort of culpability for the idea that they, in fact, are responsible for billions of dollars worth of healthcare expenditures, not to mention the significant shortening of our overall health span, our quality of life that comes from eating these products. I don't want to say that this is or isn't fair because fairness is kind of a challenging term to define, but I think what I'm saying here is that it's unreasonable that we allow ourselves to continue to listen to these untruths, to these false statements put out by these companies as to what their food products and beverage products are or are not doing. I think that they're weaseling out of explaining the fact that these foods have a known negative consequence on our health and that they are actively manipulating our brains to make it more likely that we continue to eat these foods despite the science that tells us that this is obviously not in our best interest. Let me give you a good example of how this is happening. In America, our children are exposed to thousands and thousands of ads for food. These tend to preferentially be ads for unhealthy foods and unhealthy beverages. Research shows that these types of ads change our children's preferences as young as the age of preschool. So then layer in all of these additional manipulations that bring in things like cartoon animal characters and bringing in these celebrities to create brand loyalty that then lasts into adulthood. Until recently, most schools in America actually had a contract with a soft drink company, a beverage company, so that they were able to more easily make these unhealthy drinks available to children. There's actually, I can certainly send out the link if it's interesting to people, but there's evidence that these companies, these junk food companies, have created lesson plans that are based around their product. And so what they're doing is, in the physical classroom, they are taking advantage of that space where children's minds are receptive, where they're supposed to be learning, and they've leveraged that to put their product there so that these kids start associating learning and just the feeling of education and the kind of comfort that comes from being near that authority figure that is the teacher with their products. So it's really being put into this, again, I don't want to use the word unfair, but really unreasonable situation where we send children to school to educate them on how the world works, and instead that time and that mental real estate is being taken over by these companies that are seeking to get these children hooked on their products for the rest of their lives. Okay, but that's kids. So surely as fully mature, fully functional brains in our adulthood, we should be able to make the healthy choices, right? It can't be the fault of the food company for producing a chemical-filled diabetes, heart disease, inducing product if we get to choose whether or not we want it. But here's the thing about our modern day environment. It is incredibly pro-inflammatory. And why does that matter? Well, we know that inflammation is correlated with all of these different health conditions, but we now understand that inflammation is correlated with worse decision making and with things like depression. So these are both states that put us at an increased frequency of making poor health decisions, like eating unhealthy foods. So if we start out early in life eating an inflammatory diet and engaging in the types of activities and the types of modern day stressors that induce inflammation in our bodies, we are starting off at a huge disadvantage as it relates to making healthier food choices later in life. So when we're children, our brains become warped, in part perhaps by this inflammation, to keep us hooked on these same unhealthy food products that are going to cause us to develop negative consequences in adulthood that include things like depression and heart disease and diabetes and some forms of cancers. So we're really being hit while we're down as children, and that is going to feed forward into a number of negative consequences later in life. Another really important consideration is that when people grow up with less resources, they experience this compounded disadvantage through the rest of their lives. You've heard of the discussion about food deserts. These are areas where there is minimal to no access to healthy food options that tend to be more frequent in places with relatively lower socioeconomic status. So how can we say that the deck isn't stacked against these people if they're in regions where it's objectively harder for them to get healthier food? We say, oh, it's still up to them, it's still their choice, it's their free will. But if you've taken away the ease of making the healthy option the default option, it's going to be more likely that they will, unfortunately, choose the unhealthy option. What's even more concerning is that in these areas, or in situations where people are at a disadvantage, they tend to be at higher risk of experiencing chronic stress as well as that inflammation. So those two things compound. As we've said in the book Brainwash, chronic stress and inflammation take your prefrontal cortex offline, and that makes it harder for us to make good decisions. So you really see how this sets people up for a lifetime of making poor decisions, but we're not talking about that. We're talking instead about people's autonomy and their ability to choose the right option. It's not as black and white as that. So the bottom line with this section, though, is to think about how wealth inequalities really run a whole lot deeper than just the superficial wealth itself, that they change the opportunities for positive wiring of the brain and subsequently predispose us to perhaps being more likely to consume these unhealthy foods, in addition to making it harder for us to think through in the most rational way possible what is or isn't good for us. So now, before I get trapped in a negativity spiral with the information I'm providing, I want to pause. The reason I've gone over all of this information is because it's so important to all of you who are interested in health to understand that it's not just about telling people to eat healthier food, and it's definitely not about blaming people for their poor food choices. The deck is clearly stacked against us, and it's simply not helpful to pin the blame on the individual when the system is manipulating our brains from birth. Instead, this is an opportunity to reframe the way that we look at dietary education and at all of the variables that go into people's choices around food. In further videos, I'm going to be talking more about my favorite strategies for re-engineering our brains, for reclaiming our brains so that we can see through this manipulation and to enable our brains to make better decisions. We'll talk about the overlap between behavioral economics, we'll talk about habits, and how to use those to make better decisions. We're also going to be talking about a range of other tactics that I like to use in order to see through that manipulation, as I've said, and to set your brain up for more consistent and more healthy decisions. If you're interested in learning more about these topics, I highly recommend the book Food Fix by Dr. Mark Hyman, where he goes into a comprehensive overview of all of the factors that are influencing our food system today and what we can start doing to heal this, unfortunately, quite damaged system. So, hope this video was interesting to you. As always, if you have comments, if you would like to contribute to the discussion, feel free to post, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. Thanks for watching.